has several derivations. One is that it was just outlaw racers. They did not want to race within the confines of the American Motorcyclist Association.
Founded in 1924, the American Motorcycle Association was the official race sanctioning body. But what if your pride and joy didn't meet the AMA's criteria?
Either their bikes were too big or they were the wrong types, and so they just formed their own race series, and they called it the Outlaw Race Series.
This was one of the original outlaw machines, a 1929 Harley-Davidson JD. In 1936, Harley itself had lobbied to have the two-cam JD excluded from competition. It was so fast that it threatened Harley's new knuckleheads. Outlaw racers of the 30s were often called cut-downs. This was the first American custom, a bike stripped down to bare bones. The end of World War II brought a turning point to the custom bike scene. Former GIs were buying up ex-Army Harleys and Indians, which could be had for as little as $50. But no one wanted to leave them in military trim.
Of course, they looked like Army surplus motorcycles. They were olive drab. They had these big fenders that kept the mud off. Well, they didn't want that, so they cut the fenders or bobbed the fenders, hence the name Bob Job or Bobber.
On a Bob Job, the rear half of the back fender was bobbed or cut off to lose extra weight. The front fender was often just junked. The custom paint of the day was also a carryover from the war. Death's heads, 8 balls, and pinup girls, once painted on warplanes, were tattooed on gas tanks. And who rode this new kind of custom?
These were a bunch of ex-servicemen that had some spare time, had a little money in their pockets, had this sort of bellowing, fearsome, two-wheeled beast, and went out and, raised a little hell.
One that was in the booze fighters was a veteran, and we all come back with the same thing in mind. Jesus, now we can kind of play and do hairy things, and nobody's shooting at us. That made a hell of a difference in life, When there's no bullets flying, by God, you can have a pretty good time.
Out for a good time. That's all the booze fighters claimed they were up to on July 4th, 1947. The motorcycle club was in Hollister, California for the annual AMA races. Barred from the official events, the bikers staged their own.
The local fuzz blocked off the main drag there for a full block so we could have drag races, burn circles, figure eights, and all this kind of wild west. And then the goddamn state highway come along. They don't know that the city cops blocked it off with the barricades on each end. They think we done it.
A rumor spread that the booze fighters had taken over the town. And what seemed like photographic evidence wasn't long in coming.
Life magazine come down and they got these fellas to pose for these wild pictures. And they connected with the booze fighters. And when Life magazine published it, it took off then. You couldn't stop it.
The man posed on the Bob Job wasn't even a biker. Yet motorcycling has never really recovered from the bad publicity. It didn't help that in 1954, Hollywood gave its take on what happened at Hollister.
They made the picture of the wild one.
It
was taken after the booze fighters. And, of course, Marlon Brando played the lead, and Lee Marvin was Wino Willie. And Wino was going to be a technical director, but he got drunk the night before, and
So he never made it.
So he wasn't a technical director.
Advisor.
The Wild Ones spawned countless other biker flicks. In the eyes of moviegoers, at least, many riders were real outlaws. On the opposite side of the law, motorcycles were also a symbol, in this case of unbending authority. Harley-Davidson was the police motorcycle by default, ever since the demise of Indian in 1953. Not that it wasn't supremely adaptable for the job.
It was very much suited at that time for police work in terms that it afforded the most comfort, it afforded the most power, and it was the most adaptive to the needs of law enforcement.
While outlaw racers stripped their machines down, the police piled it on. A police bike had to carry a bulky two-way radio mounted above the rear fender. Microphone and speaker were mounted on the left handlebar. The siren of those days was known as a growler.
This is one of the old-style mechanical sirens that was used in the 60s eras on the Harley-Davidson motorcycle. The principle was that this portion here rested on the rear tire of the motorcycle, and as the motorcycle went fast, it made a high-pitched siren sound, and as it went slower, it made a growling sound. Hence, the nickname of this was called the growler.
The famous look of the motor officer was highly traditional, derived in large part from the mounted police. The tall, spit-shined boots are those of cavalry officers, as are the tucked-in riding breeches, tailored to the needs of the motorcycle cop.
There's a lot of safety features built into this uniform, like the double thickness on the knees, on the pants, and the double thickness on the rear portion of the pants. All of that's for safety reasons.
Among policemen, there's a great deal of prestige in being a motor officer. They are the most visible officers on the road. In traffic, they are often the first on the scene of an accident or crime. Going by riding prowess and time in the saddle, the cop is the ultimate biker. And yes, his primary duty is to hand out tickets.
The day in the life of a motor officer would consist of writing a good number of tickets, so it requires a lot of starting and stopping, accelerating, decelerating. It's a busy day, in my opinion.
On the flip side of motorcycling in the 60s, there was a new scene. Now there were self-proclaimed outlaws on wheels, the Hells Angels and their many imitators. And what they rode was a radical new kind of custom. Mile-long forks, sky-high handlebars, ear-splitting pipes, eye-popping paint, the chopper. Each one of these machines was a personal expression of its owner. But though no two were exactly alike, there were some rules of engagement. Choppers were usually Harley-Davidsons and often had rigid rear ends. Rigids had no shock absorbers at the rear axle. It made for a kidney-jolting ride, but what bikers got in return was a feeling of being hardwired to their bikes.
I like that positive feel of a rigid where just, you know, you got to pay attention and, you know, you're kind of one with the bike, literally.
As for those exaggerated front forks, so long they made the wheels look tiny by comparison, they were yet another legacy of World War II.
I think this front end right here, which was a Harley-Davidson like military XA front end, which is a couple inches longer, so it made the bike sit up higher for better ground clearance. And I think that's probably what a lot of guys use to, you know, raise their bike up, and it gave it a little bit more radical look. To go even farther, guys used to take, you know, early Ford radius rods, which had the same, you know, general shape, and they could hack these off and plug them right in there, and they'd make the front end like this long.
And once those forks started stretching out, all bets were off.
It's the typical American way, man. If 3 inches good, then 20 inches is like way better, you know. Jimmy's got a 3/0 front end. Well, screw him. I want a 6/0, you know, and I want big giant bars. You know, there's no way Jimmy's gonna have a better bike than me.
Bikers have one-upped each other ever since. This film, shot in the late 70s, shows an extreme moment in the evolution of choppers. By then, there were radically stepped seats, tall sissy bars for the passenger to kick back on, those high handlebars called ape hangers, and at the other extreme, short flat handlebars called drag bars, stretched gas tanks, wild paint jobs, and acres of gleaming chrome completed the outlaw ride. The chopper is one of the most enduring of custom styles. Cues from the 60s and 70s have found their way to modern Harley-Davidsons. And And today, one of the most coveted rides of all is a West Coast chopper by old school builder Jesse James.
I like them to look like there's not enough parts there to make it run. You know, a couple major components are missing. You know, they must be. That bike can't even run. And people are standing around like having an argument whether it runs or not, and then I jump on it, do a big burnout, and they're gone.
Back in the 60s and 70s, while cops and bikers were loyal to their Harley Davidsons, the motorcycle world was completely changing around them. Next, Triumphs versus Sportsters, Mods versus Rockers, and the British motorcycle industry versus Mr. Honda. You may not have known it if you just rode Harleys, but the 50s and 60s were a time of dizzying change. The British came to visit. The Japanese came to stay. Scooters came and went. And it all began in 1948 with a man in a bathing suit and swim cap. American rider Rolly Free is seen here practicing for a record attempt on a British-made Vincent. The stomach-down riding position was optimal for minimizing wind resistance, even though the rider couldn't see where he was going. But on September 13th, 1948, at the Bonneville Salt Flats, Free went even further.
He went like 149.9. He just couldn't get faster than that. So he took off his leathers and his boots, stripped down to essentially his underwear, a bathing suit, and laid on the bike and broke 150. That gave him the aerodynamics he needed just to get over there.
In a chase car, a photographer captured the moment.
Life magazine printed that picture, and everybody in America instantly knew that there was this motorcycle from England called a Vincent that would go 150 miles an hour.
And that bike cemented the Vincent legend. It was the fastest bike in the world, and certainly it looked the part.
At a time when a stock Harley could do maybe 90 miles an hour, the honest 150 on a Vincent speedometer was mind-blowing.
This was a rocket ship to the moon, virtually. 150 miles an hour, that was a magic number.
Vincents, like this 1953 Black Shadow, were elite, expensive machines. Not so the other British motorcycles. The pound had been devalued after World War II, making British wheels relatively cheap.
The cry was export or die. So that's where you got a lot of the sports cars, the Austin Healey's, the Bug-Eye Sprites, the Triumphs, and that's where you got a lot of the motorcycles, Triumph, Norton, BSA, Ariel, AJS, I mean, the list goes on and on.
Many of these bikes could do the ton, as the British called the 100-mile-an-hour mark, right out of the crate. And they were covered with metallic eye candy.
The British always had very good-looking components on their bike. They had nice chrome, they had beautifully polished cases, they had a very nice aesthetic sense.
Throughout the 50s, the British had bragging rights on Main Street. After all, wasn't Marlon Brando in The Wild One riding a British-made Triumph?
And here, a motorcycle races a hot rod. You asked for it.
For a television showdown between a hot rod and a motorcycle, a Triumph Thunderbird was chosen.
Go!